Welcome to the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast. Today I'm discussing a corporations question. It is from the California Bar. This is part of our series of podcasts on how to approach each section of the California Bar. Your Bar Exam Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the bar exam experience so you can study effectively, stay sane, and hopefully pass and move on with your life. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on your favorite listening app and check out our sister podcast, the Law School Toolbox Podcast. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on barexamtoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started. Welcome back. Today we are walking through a California corporations question. This is part of our series of podcasts talking about how to approach questions on the California Bar Exam. Today we're dealing with how to draft rule statements. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you won't miss any upcoming essay discussions. Concise rule statements are very important on the California Bar. In California, the rule statements are important, yes, but you get the majority of the points from the analysis, not the rule statements. So your rule statements should not be a treatise on a given issue. It should just be as much material as you need to do the required analysis. That is all. Any extra stuff and you just won't get points for it. So it's a waste of time. So as you are memorizing the rule statements, make sure you are memorizing them in a short and concise way. The better you are at delivering short and concise rule statements, the more time you have for analysis and typically the more points you will collect. Now, before we walk through today's question, we need to do a quick review of the law you will want to know for this question. All right, so one of the things that often comes up in corporations is piercing the corporate veil. A corporation will normally protect stockholders from being personally liable for the corporation's debt, but this shield is not absolute. The corporate veil may be pierced when 1. Corporate formalities are ignored, 2. When the corporation is inadequately capitalized at the onset, and 3. To prevent fraud. When the corporate entity is found to be insufficient or the veil is pierced, the person composing the corporate entity may be held personally liable. If the corporation is the alter ego of a sole proprietor, its separate identity may be ignored. Corporations with very few shareholders are also more likely to be pierced. Corporate formalities include things like annual meetings of the board of directors and annual meetings of the stockholders. Courts are much more likely to pierce the corporate veil in tort cases as opposed to contract cases. The next area that we need to review is derivative suits by shareholders. A derivative suit is one in which the shareholder sues on behalf of the corporation on the theory that the corporation has been injured by the wrongdoing of a third person, typically an insider. To bring a derivative suit, the shareholder must have owned stock in the corporation when the claim arose, and it must continue to own stock throughout the litigation. The shareholder must also make a demand on the board of directors to have the corporation bring suit. Suits for breach of the duty of care or duty of loyalty are usually derivative. The duty of care means that the directors of a corporation must act with the care that a prudent person would take with regard to their own business. The duty of loyalty means that a director must not receive an unfair benefit to the detriment of the corporation or shareholders unless there has been a material disclosure and independent ratification. This often involves self-dealing or usurping corporate opportunities. Next, a bit about personal or direct suits by shareholders. In these suits, a minority shareholder is claiming that a majority shareholder has behaved unjustly towards her. The duty owed by the majority shareholder must be to the individual shareholder rather than to the corporate entity. This often involves a refusal to pay dividends. Courts will not pierce the corporate veil for shareholders. Insider claims. When a corporation goes bankrupt, its shareholders and officers will often become among the corporation's creditors. The same principles we discussed before that would lead a court to pierce the corporate veil may also lead the bankruptcy court to disallow an insider's claim entirely or make that claim subordinate to claims of non-insiders under the doctrine of equitable subordination. Inadequate capitalization, failure to follow corporate formalities, and fraud or wrongdoing by the insider may all lead a bankruptcy court to apply equitable subordination. If shareholders have contributed funds to the company, but have denominated all or nearly all of their contributions as loans rather than capital, the court may treat some or all of this as capital, in which case the stockholder will forfeit this equity in the bankruptcy. This will usually happen when the stated capital is clearly inadequate for the corporation's expected business. Okay, now let's move on to reading the California Bar question. This question is from February 2017. We will link to a webpage where you can find this question in the show notes if you'd like to read along. All right, here we go. Years ago, Art Incorporated Retail Inc. He paid $100 for its stock and lent it $50,000. He elected himself and 2 family members to the board of directors, which in turn elected him as president and approved a 10-year lease for a store. He managed the store and was paid 10% of retail's gross revenues as compensation. Subsequently, Barbara bought 20% of retail's stock from Art. Retail's board approved the contract to buy 30% of the inventory of XYZ Company, a company owned by Art. Subsequently, Art began taking home some of retail's inventory without paying for it. Retail had net profits in some years and net losses in others. It paid dividends in some years, but not in others. In some years, Retail's board met 3 times a year, in others it never met. Recently, Retail ceased business. Its assets were limited to $5,000 in cash. Among the claims against Retail was by one supplier who was owed $10,000 for computer equipment. Another claim was Art's for the $50,000 that he had lent and had just become due. Supplier and Barbara individually filed lawsuits against Retail and Art. So now we have the call to the question. Number 1, on what theory, if any, can supplier reasonably seek to recover against Art on its claim against Retail? Discuss. Number 2, does Barbara have a cause of action against Art, either derivatively or personally? Discuss. Number 3, if Retail is forced into bankruptcy court, will Art be able to collect from Retail any portion of his $50,000 loan? Discuss. So one of the things that strikes me about this question as you listen to it or as you read it is it's not very long. So all of the facts in this question are incredibly important because they have to give you enough information to answer all 3 parts of this question. The first thing you should do is mark up your exam paper to assess what is legally significant about each fact in the fact pattern. Years ago, Art Incorporated Retail Inc. So it's worth taking note that you will not be dealing with anything involving timelines, no date noted really, or the process of incorporation. He paid $100 for its stock and lent it $50,000. This is relevant to whether bankruptcy court is likely to treat the $50,000 as a loan or as capital. He elected himself and 2 family members to the board of directors, which in turn elected him as president and approved a 10-year lease for a store. At this point, there was only one shareholder, who is also the president and a member of the board of directors. This is relevant to whether the corporation is just an alter ego for Art. He managed the store and was paid 10% of Retail's gross revenues as compensation. This may also be relevant to whether this was an alter ego for Art, as there's no indication that any other director was involved in the day-to-day business. Subsequently, Barbara bought 20% of Retail stock from Art. This means that there are 2 shareholders, which is relevant to whether the veil can be pierced. 20% means that Art still holds a definite majority, which is relevant to whether he owes her, personally, a duty of care. It is also important to note when Barbara got her stock. In order to bring the derivative suit, she must have been a shareholder when the cause of action arose. Retail's board approved a contract to buy 30% of the inventory of XYZ Co., a company owned by Art. Because XYZ is owned by Art, there is some concern about self-dealing. The fact that the board of directors approved the contract is important to whether this self-dealing may have breached the duty of loyalty. Subsequently, Art began taking home some of Retail's inventory without paying for it. Fraud or wrongdoing by the defendant's stockholders can lead a court to pierce. Presumably, Art is taking Retail's inventory for his own use, which would indicate that he is draining corporate assets, and this qualifies, not so surprising, as wrongdoing. This is also relevant as to whether Art breached his duty of care to the corporation. Retail had net profits in some years and losses in others. It paid dividends in some years, but not others. These 2 facts are mostly relevant together and to Barbara's potential individual claim. Businesses have ups and downs in terms of profits, and it's reasonable to infer that Retail paid dividends in years where there were some profits. In some years, retail's board met 3 times a year. In others, it never met. The rule is that boards of directors should meet annually. Their failure to meet some years indicates that they are not following corporate formalities, and this is relevant to piercing the corporate veil. Recently, retail ceased business, and its assets were limited to $5,000 in cash. This is important for figuring out which creditors can be paid. Among the claims against a retailer was one by a supplier who was owed $10,000 for computer equipment. One of the creditors who wants to recover is supplier. Note that the amount is higher than retail's assets. Another claim was Art's for the $50,000 that he had lent and had just become due. Art's claim may be subject to either equitable subordination or treatment as capital. Okay, so now let's look at how to actually answer this question. You should start any outline or answer by breaking your paper into the 3 sections that were the 3 calls of the question. Let's review those one more time. On what legal theory, if any, can supplier reasonably seek to recover against Art on its claim against retail? Discuss. Number 2, does Barbara have a cause of action against Art either derivatively or personally? Discuss. Number 3, if retail is forced into bankruptcy court, will Art be able to collect from retail any portion of his $50,000 loan? Discuss. Now, before we get started, these questions involve many rules that can be broken out into sub-rules. So how do you deal with sub-rules? Well, there you have a few different options. So typically what I like to do is present the overarching rule up front. And then if you have sub-rules, talk about the sub-rules as needed to apply them. I don't like having really long rule statements that are just overarching an entire section if it makes sense to do the analysis piece by piece, like an overall analysis and then additional sub-rules. But always keep in mind that you want to break things into elements and have things as organized as possible because of the speed at which people are grading these exams. Remember, they're only taking 2 to 3 minutes to read your answer. So if you've got sub-rules, make sure you have headers or separate paragraphs to really call out those sub-rules so they can easily see that you discussed those nuances and applied them and you can get all the points for it. All right, so let's start with the first call of the question. Supplier wants to recover $10,000 from Art individually for its claim against retail. In order to do this, supplier must pierce the corporate veil. So again, note that this question involves multiple factors that have to be weighed, which should be broken down into sub-rules whenever possible. So the rule here is, although a corporation will usually shield stockholders from being personally liable for corporate debt, courts may pierce the corporate veil when the corporate formalities are ignored, when the corporation is inadequately capitalized at the onset, and to prevent fraud. So some sub-rules as to corporate formalities. A board of directors must meet annually to elect officers. According to the facts, the board met 3 times some years and none other years. So this tends to indicate that retail was ignoring corporate formalities and weighs in favor of supplier. A corporation must also hold annual stockholders meetings, and the facts don't indicate that this ever happened. This tends to indicate that retail was ignoring corporate formalities and weighs in favor of supplier. Also, we have the issue of adequate capitalization. Art paid $100 for his shares and made a $50,000 loan to the corporation. The court may view this as a capital investment, which may have been an adequate amount at the time. But if the defendant stockholder engaged in fraud or wrongdoing, a court is likely to pierce the corporate veil. The facts indicate that Art was taking retail's inventory without paying, presumably for personal use. This may rise to the level of draining corporate assets, which would weigh in favor of piercing the corporate veil. We also should note that the corporate veil is more likely to be pierced when the corporation is dominated by one or a small number of shareholders, especially when the targeted shareholder is active in the business. In this case, there are only 2 shareholders, Art and Barbara. Art owns 80% of the business. He's also the director, the president, and runs the store on a day-to-day basis. This weighs heavily in favor of piercing the corporate veil. In addition, the corporate veil is more likely to be pierced in tort law than contract law. Supplier's claim is a contract claim, which weighs against piercing. But overall, by looking at all these rules, the conclusion is that a court is likely to pierce the corporate veil, so supplier can hold Art directly liable for the remaining amount owed to it, which is $5,000. Note that the sample answers have one answer where the tester reached an opposite conclusion and still got full points, and that seems to be fine, because what's really important here is the analysis of all of the things you could talk about as far as piercing the corporate veil. Now, number 2. Barbara wants to sue Art. Note that this question should be broken up into sub-issues as well. So first, Barbara's derivative claim against Art. In order to bring a derivative suit, the shareholder must have owned stock in the corporation when the claim arose and throughout litigation. The shareholder must also make a demand on the board of directors to have the corporation bring suit. Facts for the general rule of the derivative suit. Barbara owns 20% of the retail. There is no indication that Barbara made a demand on the board of directors, which could prevent her from moving forward with the derivative suit. In this case, there are two duties that Art may have breached. The duty of care. A director must act with the care of a prudent person would use in regard to his own business. Now, taking corporate property for one's own use is a breach of the duty of care. Art was taking retail's inventory home, so he probably did breach the duty of care. The duty of loyalty says the director may not receive an unfair benefit to the detriment of the corporation or shareholders unless there's been a material disclosure and independent ratification. Here, Art receives a salary from retail, but there's no indication that his salary is excessive. Now, retail entered into a contract with a company owned by Art. This contract, however, was approved by the board, so Art probably did not breach the duty of loyalty. If Barbara makes an appropriate demand on the board of directors, she may be able to bring a derivative action against Art for his breach of the duty of care when he took corporate property for his own personal use. Now, what about Barbara's individual claim against Art? A minority shareholder may bring suit against a majority shareholder if there is evidence that the majority shareholder treated her unjustly. This usually involves a failure to pay dividends. According to the facts, dividends were probably paid in years when the company made profits and not when the company suffered losses. So this is a reasonable decision by the board of directors. So the conclusion is there's no evidence that the majority shareholder, Art, acted unjustly towards her or that he prevented the board of directors from paying dividends when it would have made sense to do so. Now, lastly, Art will want to collect some of his $50,000 loan from retail if they go into bankruptcy court. Note that there are two rules that the court could apply to Art's situation. First, under the doctrine of equitable subordination, a court may make an insider's claim against corporate assets subordinate to the claims of other creditors if the corporation was inadequately capitalized, the corporation failed to follow corporate formalities, or the insider engaged in fraud or wrongdoing. These are the same factors discussed previously with regard to piercing the corporate veil. Note that if you stated the rule effectively earlier in your essay, you may be able to reference those rules and the analysis here to save yourself time. There are independent facts to show whether the corporation was adequately capitalized, but retail's board did not follow corporate formalities, and Art, by taking retail's inventory, engaged in wrongdoing. If Art's $50,000 was a loan rather than capital, his $100 payment for the stock was probably insufficient capitalization. So in conclusion, a court is likely to make Art's claim subordinate to supplier's claim. Now, if shareholders have contributed funds to the company but have determined those funds as loan rather than capital, the court may treat some or all of this as capital. Art paid $100 and loaned $50,000. $100 was probably insufficient capital for the company, so the court may find that some or all of the loan should be treated as capital. So in conclusion, Art's loan will either be subordinate to suppliers or will be treated by the court as capital. Because retail only has $5,000 in assets, Art will not be able to recover either way. All right, so that is the end to our discussion of the question. Now, before we go, writing rule statements is not the most important part of your bar essay writing, but being prepared to do so quickly and efficiently can give you a lot more confidence as you write your all-important analysis. So please make sure you have effective attack plans so you can efficiently memorize the law and write out rule statements as you need them on the exam. And with that, we're out of time. I want to take a second to remind you to check out our blog at barexamtoolbox.com, which is full of helpful tips to help you prepare and stay sane as you study for the bar exam. You can also find information on our website about our courses, tools, and one-on-one tutoring programs to support you as you study for the UBE or California bar exam. If you enjoyed this episode of the Bar Exam Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you are still in law school, you might want to also check out our popular Law School Toolbox podcast as well. If you have any questions or comment, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Alison Lee at barexamtoolbox.com or Alison at barexamtoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at barexamtoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.